Bailing out the banks cost global governments some 20% of GDP recently, and amid the subsequent calls for better risk governance, one can discern some logical determination of how to properly manage and calculate risk. Well, one of those logical voices belongs to INSEAD Banking and Finance Professor Jean Dermine, who joins us today on INSEAD Knowledge to look at risk governance beyond the global banking crisis. Thanks for coming back. All right. Bank boards' poor governance are being blamed for the collapse to some extent. Is this a valid charge? Was it the bank board's problem? Did they know to whom their responsibility lay, or what's going on here?
I think there are two issues. So it was well documented that many boards were not informed about the risk taken by banks, and that's clearly wrong. And then because of this, various public authorities like the Basel Committee, the European Commission, have been writing papers recently on corporate governance of banks. And I think this is extremely important because some papers, like the Walker report in the UK, are still very much on the shareholder value management type.
Which is kind of bottom line, make sure they get their profits and the
that
share
is to
price
say
goes
the
up.
main mission of a board is to work for the interest of shareholders. And then we see very recently the Basel Committee and the European Commission coming from proposal to extend the responsibility of a board also to worry about depositors, to worry about other stakeholders. I think this is a major change of governance that should be discussed.
So what is that change actually? Give me an idea of who the stakeholders are in banks as opposed to just the shareholders who own the stock.
So to quote the Basel Committee, says very explicitly that in discharging their responsibilities, board members should be looking not only after the interest of shareholders, but also the interest of depositors, bank soundness, and other stakeholders. I think when we address these issues, I think it should not be driven at all by ideology. So it should not be the bad boys of capitalism versus another system. I think we should have a cold analysis of what is best for society.
So you would have the boards decide to be able to take risks and be able to make decisions for the bank in compliance with government regulations, which should be safeguarding society.
It is very clear. So the government banking authorities should provide the rules of the game, and in doing so should take care about the safety of the banking system. And then within these rules, the board of banks will have to work for the interest of their company, in particular in the area of innovations. Okay,
so was the problem that there were no appropriate regulations, or there were regulations there that were just ignored?
I think there are two sets of problems. I think there's the first one you mentioned at the level of the board, that some boards were not informed about the risk. And there I would say, because often there's a debate whether there should be many finance persons on the board of banks, I would think personally that more than finance, we need individuals with character who would be strong enough to oppose a CEO that may have a very short-term view. The mission of the board is to look at the long-term interest of a firm. There clearly you need character at the level of board members. And then the other side is that indeed various regulations were simply not enforced. As an example, people often criticize the Basel II regulation, but if people read Basel II, there were explicit call for liquidity regulation. That was written in Basel II. There's a question, why is it that was not enforced by regulators?
How do you feel about the bank stress tests? Are they something that boards and regulators should be looking at more carefully? Are they valid, these bank stress tests?
So first, if indeed the board has to take into account the long-term interest of a company, and that's why we talk about long-term value creation, not just short-term profit, clearly a board has to make sure that the company is able to go through shock in the economy. And therefore, indeed, for a board, it is of vital importance that they are made aware of stress tests, that is to see under which condition, which type of risk their bank could go under, and then they may decide to take on other risk. At the same time, central banks that are concerned with the safety of the economy also will want to run this stress test. So I would say this is very basic common sense. So yes, for sure, stress tests are important. By the way, they are not new. They were already in the regulation. Maybe they were not implemented.
Were the ones that were just run and the results came out over the summer, were they tough enough? Were they too tough?
Of course, you remember the history that the US ran stress tests about a year ago to reassure the market that the US banks were solvent. At the time, the Europeans didn't want to disclose public information, and there was massive pressure of the US authorities, in particular Mr. Geithner, asking the Europeans to come up with stress tests. And then this huge pressure, the Europeans decided to go with public stress tests last July. But really, when you read the stress tests, you can see that these were not stress tests at all. If I can just give you an example, if you go to the end of the report, which may take you up to page 40, 55 in the report, you will see that when they look at a stress test on the real estate market, as an example, in the case of Spain, they were looking at a drop of price, real estate price in Spain of 15%. At the same time, if one was reading The Economist showing that compared to average, real estate prices in Spain were 50% overvalued. So an example is the European stress test with a small 15% drop of real estate, where other reports were showing that possibly this market is overvalued by 50%.
That's a big difference.
The difference is huge, and therefore, if I can make the point, this shows clearly what happened when regulators or banking supervisors are not independent of public authorities. Okay, because they were not independent of public authorities, clearly they could not come out publicly with a report that would show big losses. That's why they came up with a very, very mild, gentile figure, telling the world if there's a stress test, the capital ratio on average of European banks would only go down by 1.3%. I mean, this is microscopic as compared to what would be a real stress test.
So will we ever get a real stress test in Europe?
Yes, there was a stress test produced by some of the rating agency that says recently if there was a shock, according to the rating agency, some of the banks could lose up to 8% of their risk-weighted asset. Again, and this is 8% compared to the 1.3% of the European stress test. It shows a huge difference in magnitude. Therefore, I would say what central bank is doing is one thing, but really at the level of the board, clearly a board must be informed at all time what kind of shock could bring their institution down, and then they must be informed, and then they must take action as to what to do.
Right. So I do have a question based on that, but first maybe you can tell me, are we in trouble here in banks, or are we okay? I mean, the banks are still marching ahead. Are we? Have we improved?
Oh, I'm quite optimistic for two reasons. Number one is that the banks have raised a very large amount of capital in the last 2 years, so the capital ratio is much, much higher than before the crisis. Two, in many countries, retail banking is quite profitable. Therefore, the potential profitability of banks is quite nice. The big concern today of what could be, of course, a shock, it is if one country ever default, that of course would create a new shock to the banking system.
Where and when do some of these liquidity issues come up? Do they come up in auditing? Can they be, if you look into a crystal ball or you have a good IT program, can they be flagged? When in this whole system does a problem show up?
So first, if we talk about liquidity risk, it is extremely rarely the first root of the problem. In banking, most of the time, it's first credit losses, sometimes trading losses that generate a panic, and then you have depositors running away, and then you have liquidity risk. So I would say the first task is to control properly credit risk, control trading risk. Now, as far as liquidity risk is concerned, I mean, there are a lot of well-known indicators forecasting cash flows, looking at liquid assets. So there are well-known indicators calculated by banks, calculated by central banks that are used to monitor liquidity. So it's not that we are missing indicator. It is of the belief in the last 10, 15 years, at least in the G20 countries, that liquidity risk was only a problem for emerging markets. In fact, the emerging market banks have always been extremely concerned with liquidity risk. It's just that people have short memories in the G20 countries. People did not believe that it could ever happen again, and that's why the system became too laxist.
What role does risk play? I mean, that's sort of the basis of free capital markets, and it's not all bad. What is the right role?
So as you say, the basis of a free market economy, that the world is changing. Therefore, companies need to innovate. That competition are forces of good with new companies coming in. Therefore, always risk will be taken. And therefore, for the board of a bank is to identify what are the likely positive outcome, what are likely negative outcome, and then take proper decision. In my view, it is only when creditors will be at risk that then there will be enough pressure to limit the risk in the banking system. Will we get there? The coming months will be very interesting, because clearly it is a matter of the will of government to establish this resolution regime. We have to be aware, in particular in Europe, that this is quite complex, because when we look at international banks doing business in different jurisdictions, then there's a problem of having different bankruptcy regime in different countries. But I'm very convinced, I'm not a lawyer, but I'm very convinced that a resolution regime can be put into place. But the question is whether there will be the will of government to put that in place.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Professor Jean Dermine, for being with us.
Thank you, Shelley.